Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. Back with some more vibes for you. I'm Mr. Giant. And someone suggested that I watch this here, and it's Dr. Shashi Tharoor MP, and it's Britain Does Owe Reparations. And they suggest I watch this here, you know what I mean? I'm gonna leave a link in the description so you could go check it out for yourself, without me talking. And I'm interested to see what this is all about, you know what I mean? So let's go ahead and YouTube and simmer.
President and gentlemen, ladies of the House, I, standing here with 8 minutes in my hands and at this venerable and rather magnificent institution, I was going to assure you that I belong to the Henry VIII School of Public Speaking, that as Henry VIII said to his wives, I shall not keep you long. But now finding myself the 7th speaker out of 8 in what must already seem a rather long evening to you, I rather feel like Henry VIII's last wife. I more or less know what's expected of me, but I'm not sure how to do it any differently. Perhaps what I should do is really try and pay attention to the arguments that were advanced by the opposition today. We had, for example, Sir Richard Ottaway suggesting, challenging the very idea that it could be argued that the economic situation of the colonies was actually worsened by the experience of British colonialism. Well, I stand to offer you the Indian example, Sir Richard. India's share of the world economy when Britain arrived on its shores was 23%. By the time the British left, it was down to below 4%.
Whoa.
Why? Simply because India had been governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's industrial revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%. Meanwhile, colonialists like Robert Clive bought their rotten boroughs in England.
In the same vein, I remember, and this is a saying I heard as a kid. I was a kid when I heard this. It says that countries like Britain and the larger countries, we would sell our cocoa and stuff to them for little fun and nothing, and then they sell it back to us in the form of candy. So in essence, we get little or nothing for it from the islands, speaking, and the sugar cane and stuff, and then it's sold back to us as products that they manufacture. That's what I used to hear as a kid a lot from politicians on the island. I'm guessing that's kind of similar to a certain degree, but that's just a thought that came to my mind there.
And on the proceeds of their loot in India, while taking the Hindi word loot into their dictionaries as well as their habits. And the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. By the end of the 19th century, the fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression. And as has been pointed out, the wealthy Victorian British families that made their money out of the slave economy, 1/5 of the elites of the wealthy class in Britain in the 19th century owed their money to transporting 3 million Africans across the waters. And in fact, in 1833, when slavery was abolished, What happened was that a compensation of £20 million was paid, not as reparations to those who had lost their lives or who had suffered or been oppressed by slavery, but to those who had lost their property. I was struck by the fact that your Wi-Fi password at this union commemorates the name of Mr. Gladstone, the great liberal hero. But I'm sorry, his family was one of those who benefited from this compensation. Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines. The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill deliberately, as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision, he peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" So all notions that the British were trying to do their colonial enterprise out of enlightened despotism to try and bring the benefits of colonialism and civilization to the benighted heathen. I'm sorry, Churchill's conduct in 43 simply one example of many that gave a lie to this myth. As others have said on the proposition, violence and racism were the reality of the colonial experience. And no wonder that the sun never set on the British Empire, because even God couldn't trust the English in the dark.
Wow.
Let me take World War I as a very concrete example, since the first speaker, Mr. Lee, suggested these things couldn't be quantified. Well, let me quantify World War I for you. Again, I'm sorry, from an Indian perspective, others have spoken of other countries. 1/6 of all the British forces that fought in the war were Indian. 54,000 Indians actually lost their lives in that war.
Didn't know that.
65,000 were wounded, another 4,000 remained missing or in prison. Indian taxpayers had to cough up £100 million in that time's money. India supplied 70 million rounds of ammunition, 600,000 rifles and machine guns, 42 million garments were stitched and sent out of India, and 1.3 million Indian personnel served in this war. I know all this because, of course, the commemoration of the centenary has just taken place. But not just that, India had to supply 173,000 animals, 370 million tons of supplies, and in the end, the total value of everything that was taken out of India. India, by the way, suffering from recession at that time and poverty and hunger, was in today's money £8 billion. You want quantification? It's available. Second World War, it was even worse, 2.5 million Indians in uniform. I won't belabor the point, but of Britain's total war debt of £3 billion, in 1945 money, 1.25 billion was owed to India and never actually paid. Somebody mentioned Scotland. Well, the fact is that colonialism actually cemented your union with Scotland. You know, the Scots had actually tried to send colonies out before 1707. They'd all failed, I'm sorry to say. But then, of course, came union, and India was available, and there you had a disproportionate employment of Scots. I'm sorry, Mr. Mackenzie has to speak after me. Engaged in this colonial enterprise as soldiers, as agents, as employees, and the earnings from India is what brought prosperity to Scotland, even pulled Scotland out of poverty. Now that India is no longer there, no wonder the bonds are loosening. Now, we've heard other arguments on this side.
This guy is speaking.
Well, let me tell you, first of all, as my colleague, the Jamaican High Commissioner, has pointed out, railways and roads were really built to serve British interests and not those of the local people. But I might add that many countries have built railways and roads without having had to be colonized in order to do so.
There's a Jamaican sitting there.
They were designed to carry raw materials from the hinterland into the ports to be shipped to Britain. And the fact is that the Indian or Jamaican or other colonial public, their needs were incidental. Transportation, there was no attempt made to match supply to demand for mass transport, none whatsoever. Instead, in fact, The Indian railways were built with massive incentives offered by Britain to British investors, guaranteed out of Indian taxes paid by Indians, with the result that you actually had 1 mile of Indian railway costing twice what it cost to build the same mile in Canada or Australia, because there was so much money being paid in extravagant returns. Britain made all the profits, controlled the technology, supplied all the equipment, and absolutely all these benefits came as private enterprise, British private enterprise, at public risk, Indian public risk. That was the railways as an accomplishment. We're hearing about aid.
See, even while talking, we have to differentiate between the people and the government. We have to differentiate. We can't just say Britain as a whole. You know what I'm saying? We have to, and I think that's something we all have to do with every single country in the world. You know, you can't just say because, let's say, Idi Amin in Uganda was a dictator, that all Ugandans are, you know, evil people because of him and his government. We have to understand that the people under him are just as scared as everybody else. And, you know, I could attest for that in my situation. I mean, I wasn't like petrified in my situation, but, you know, there are certain people that you just don't say things, you know, against, because you're going to get persecuted or prosecuted. You know what I'm saying? And that's why I'm always about the people more than anything else, because, you know, like I said, coming to this country, you realize that most of the people here don't really know what happened in my country. They just don't. They're not taught that here. You know what I mean? And if they were taught that, they were taught, well, you know, it's a great endeavor, this happened and that happened, but they don't know what was happening to the people before that. They will just know what was happening to the people by what they were told. You know what I mean? So they could say that government is communist, but doesn't mean all the people, you know, follow that government's policy. You know, and that goes for the case here too. It goes for the same case in any country. So, you know, and in a way, when people talk about reparations, I could understand like the poor people in that country going, why? We don't have anything. Why should we give them anything? Because the people who don't have anything in that country is generations of not having anything. So if they're giving those people reparations for what happened to them, what about us? And, you know, I'm not saying it's wrong or right. I'm just looking at both sides, you know what I mean? Jumping over fences and trying to understand, you know? But, so, I think when people say stuff, they need to, not him in particular, but in general, and I try to do that. That's why I say we and not them. And I try to maintain that. Somebody corrected me when I said the other one time, and I totally get that. It's we, it's all of us. We have to take a step back and look at vibe and then draw a conclusion from there. You know, if we do so, we step back and we take a look at what's going on, we'll all realize we're pretty much in the same boat. And there's a certain group that's controlling everything that we do. And in a lot of the cases, everything that we think. And this is not a conspiracy theory. That's just the way politics work. You know what I mean? And like I said in an earlier video, there's dynasties in politics. You see the same people and their children and their cousins and all of them is in politics. You know what I'm saying? Whereas, you know, on a rare occasion, a simple man will come up and get power. Unfortunately, in a lot of those cases, the simple man that get power does it militarily because, you know, he's tail war. But anyway, let's keep going. Yeah, I'm babbling too much. Sorry.
Enterprise at public risk, Indian public risk. That was the railways as an accomplishment. We're hearing about aid. I think it was again Sir Richard Ottery mentioned British aid to India. Well, let me just point out that British aid to India is about 0.4% of India's GDP.
I think he knows that too. You know what I mean? It's, because
fertilizer subsidies which might be
He's
an
talking about
appropriate
government
metaphor for
stuff
that
here.
argument. If I may point out as well, that as my fellow speakers from the proposition have pointed out, there have been incidents of racial violence, of loot, of massacres, of bloodshed, of transportation, in India's case, even of one of our last Mughal emperor. Yes, maybe today's Britons are not responsible for some of these depredations, but the same speakers have pointed with pride to their foreign aid. You're not responsible for the people starving in Somalia, but you give them aid. Surely the principle of reparations for the wrongs that have been done cannot be denied. It's been pointed out, for example, the dehumanization of Africans in the Caribbean, the massive psychological damage that has been done, the undermining of social traditions, of property rights, of the authority structures of these societies, all in the interests of British colonialism. And the fact remains that many of today's problems in these countries, including the persistence, in some cases the creation of racial and ethnic and religious tensions, were the direct result of the colonial experience. So there is a moral debt that needs to be paid. Someone challenged reparations elsewhere. Well, I'm sorry, Germany doesn't just give reparations to Israel. It also gave reparations to Poland. Perhaps some of the speakers here are too young to remember the dramatic picture of Chancellor Willy Brandt on his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970. And there are other examples. There is Italy's reparations to Libya. There's Japan's to Korea. Even Britain has paid reparations to the New Zealand Maoris. So it's not as if this is something unprecedented or unheard of that's going to somehow open some sort of nasty Pandora's box. No wonder Professor Lewis reminded us that he's from Texas. There's a wonderful expression in Texas that summarizes the arguments of the opposition: all hat and no cattle. Now, if I can just quickly look through the notes I was scribbling while they were speaking, there was reference to democracy and rule of law. Let me say with the greatest possible respect, it's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for 200 years and then celebrate the fact that they're democratic at the end of it. We were denied democracy, sir. We had to snatch it, seize it from you. With the greatest reluctance, it was conceded in India's case after 150 years of British rule, and that too with limited franchise. Yes, indeed, ma'am.
The opposition spoke quite highly of Greek and Athenian democracy on which the West should pride itself, and spoke of liberty and equality in that same name. The Athenian democracy was only functioning because of the slave society on which it was built. That's the nature of colonisation.
All right, I don't think that needs contradiction, not from me at any rate. but if I may just point out, I think the argument made by a couple of the speakers, the first speaker, Mr. Lee in particular, conceded all the evil atrocities of colonialism, but essentially suggested that reparations won't really help. They won't help the right people. They'll be used as a propaganda tool. They'll embolden people like Mr. Mugabe. It's always nice how in the old days, I'm sorry to say that the people of the Caribbean used to frighten their children into behaving and sleeping by saying Sir Francis Drake would come after them. That was a legacy. now it's Mugabe will be there. So this is the new sort of Sir Francis Drake of our times. The fact is very simply, sir, that we are not talking about reparations as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for you to atone for the wrongs that have been done. And I am quite prepared to accept the proposition that you can't put a monetary sum on the kinds of horrors people have suffered. Certainly no amount of money can expiate the loss of a loved one, as somebody pointed out there. You're not going to be able to figure out an exact amount, but the principle is what matters. The fact is that to speak blithely of sacrifices on both sides, as an analogy was used here, a burglar comes into your house, ransacks the place, stubs his toe, and you say, well, there was a sacrifice on both sides. That, I'm sorry to say, is not an acceptable argument. The truth is that we are not arguing specifically that vast sums of money need to be paid. The proposition before this House is the principle of owing reparations. not the fine points of how much is owed, to whom it should be paid. The question is there a debt? Does Britain owe reparations? As far as I'm concerned, the ability to acknowledge a wrong that has been done, to simply say sorry, will go a far, far, far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of aid. What is required, it seems to me, is accepting the principle that reparations are owed. Personally, I'd be quite happy if it was £1 a year for the next 200 years after the last 200 years of Britain and India. Thank you very much, Madam President.
See, that last point he made, let it go. I ain't going to cut it off here, but the last point that he made, I like what he said there. It's not so much an amount. Reparations, okay, I'll draw a reference to here, because a lot of people keep saying here in the US, reparations as far as a donkey and a plot of land. That's not going to do anything in these modern times. Do stuff like really strengthen the education system in disenfranchised areas. Because right now, and the thing about it too is it's all the same thing in black neighborhoods, the education system is definitely below every other thing, every other place. But on the flip side, I live in a predominantly white state, and the education system is in the same dire straits. So, like, reparation, strengthen the education, because with the education that people are going to receive, they could compete. Whereas if you give them money or land, that's going to be gone like that, and then they're back in the same shoes, because you give poor people of any race any money, it's gone like that. And who is getting the money when it's gone like that? The rich people. And I thought there's good rich people. I ain't gonna sit here and say all of that. But the point is I'm trying to make here is strengthen the educational system, because with that they could compete. I would rather see that than a monetary sum just to give them money, because they wouldn't know how to invest if they're not educated enough to invest. It's still going to cause disparities, because then let's say you give African Americans or Africans money, or let's just put it that way, they give them the money directly. They don't know how to invest that money. They don't know how to build a business. But if you educate them, they could go out and compete. And quite frankly, the way the world is, and listen, I have politicians that just, I know, bad of me. Somebody pointed that out in the comment section. I just don't trust them. You give a government the money, how do we know the money is going to go to the people? How are we going to know they wouldn't be giving the land to specific type of people, like, they say, a land and a pony. You know what I'm saying? So how is it going to be done? You say education across the board. Make that better. Give them, what's that old saying? You give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. But give him a line to go fish, he'll eat forever, because he could go fish anytime he wants. I might be really butchering that, but that's the paraphrasing that I come up with. So you know what I mean? Everybody's wanting material stuff, but I think the Caribbean has come a long way because of education. Like my country is 90-something% literate, 95, 96% literate. You know what I mean? And you see West Indians all over the world doing really well. You know what I mean? Of course, on the island, they having trouble there because, once again, governments aren't the best oil machines. But that reparation things is such a big thing, and I could understand. And I'll give you an example. I had a friend of mine who was from Japan, and we went to a museum in Washington D.C., and there was some Japanese etching. Printmaking stuff there, and he looked so sad, and he said, I can't even see this in Japan. We don't even have our own art there. It was taken from us during the Second World War, so I'm seeing stuff that we don't even see in our country. I don't know if it was taken He said it was taken, but then some of it was given away by crooked people. You know what I'm saying and thing? But, you know, yeah, give them people back their stuff. I think there's been some stuff being given back to some African countries here recently. I read it somewhere last year or this year sometime. But that reparation things there, we also have to understand that the people who they say to give them the stuff, then there's the poor people who are part of that group who didn't have anything to do with anything, and in some cases are being oppressed now. I'm not saying back then, but now being oppressed. Of course they're going to go, hey, what about us? You know what I mean? And we can't go, well, your ancestors did this, so, you know, you could just suck it up because we're here now. So something needs to be done. We need to, you know, and I'd admit some people have done their best to get education out there to people and stuff like that. But, you know, give them stuff so they could compete in the future, not just to have stuff. You know, comment down below. Tell me what you think of that opinion of mine. But let's watch the ending of this. Let's see if anything else come up after this. I guess not. Thank you for suggesting that. That was really interesting. You know what I mean? And his main thing was for the, you know, India, and India had a lot more than islands in the Caribbean to take from them, and it was definitely a wider scale. You know what I'm saying and thing, and I guess coming from a small island, it was more manageable for us than it was for them, because we didn't have different tribes or anything. We were just one people, 110,000 people on an island. That's just one group of people. You know what I mean? But it's an interesting thing. Tell me what you all think in the comment section about that. Please, no arguing, no fighting, no calling names. Let's just talk. I just lived through 4 years and still ongoing of constant fighting and calling the names and telling people they're stupid and ignorant and all of that. Let's not do that. Let's just talk about this. Because if we don't talk, we won't get to understand how each other feels. We got to start talking and stop wanting to debate and argue and all of that. If it means taking care of other humans and taking care of humans in general, let's have a conversation, all right? Listen, man, you all take care of each other out there, okay? Cool runnings. Link in the description for this video.